Hey everybody, welcome to The Bottom Line. Michael Noland here, and tonight I'm going to be covering Led Zeppelin's final album, in some ways, the album CODA. Now, when I say in some ways, what I'm talking about is the fact that although all four members are equally represented and very well on this album, it is an album that was put together after Bonzo died. So we'll never know what tracks and what songs he might have suggested and demand be on that album. As a matter of fact, would they have ever even put out this album if they had decided to continue as a band? Now, I can think of 3 songs on this album that Led Zeppelin may have later released on a later album, right? They had done this before with Physical Graffiti, and 3 of these tracks were outtakes or were tracks that were very seriously considered as tracks for In Through the Outdoor, and we'll discuss that as well. But first, I want to just say thank you to all of our viewers, and especially to any of our new subscribers. Now, at the end of this video, as usual, I'll include names of new subscribers if they've come aboard between my last video and this one. But I gotta say, the comments I'm getting on this channel, you guys as a whole are so well informed. You know, I do a lot of research on these videos, and just when I think I've covered it all, 5 or 6 of you at a time will correct me on things, and you know what? Thank you. That's what I want. But you know, I always try to give you exactly what occurred as well as my thoughts on the music. And of course, that's only to start the ball rolling, right? Now, the reason that I'm covering this album here tonight, most of you probably thought the next album up for review was Presence, and it is coming. But there is a reason why I jumped over to CODA, and by the time I'm done with my series reviewing all 9 Led Zeppelin studio albums, I'll continue that with covering their live albums, then their live DVDs, as well as some of the many bootleg albums out that people still listen to today and collect avidly. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to make that quick announcement, and that's why we're talking about CODA tonight. You see, one of the reasons that Led Zeppelin even released these tracks was that Jimmy Page felt that so many fans were collecting, and he knew, the band knew, there were tons of bootleg albums out there that bands were actively trading, almost like your favorite Beatle cards, right? And he wanted at least one album of Led Zeppelin's more bootleg sound done right. Now, I want to talk about the album cover artwork here. This is wonderful, and another album cover by the graphic artist team Hypnosis, or as I like to call them, Hip-Gnosis. Yeah, I get the joke. It's cool. I love that name. And they created some of Led Zeppelin's very best album covers. And many think this was kind of like a throwback, but not really. You see the font type that they use here? It's from a brand new font at the time called Neon. And you can see why they call it Neon here. But look at the background. It's almost a canvas, isn't it? And here we see again Led Zeppelin identifying with 2 different extremes. Even their name, Led, heavy, Zeppelin, light, Neon, new, canvas, old. Wonderful. And this album is exactly what this cover indicates. Now, another reason I decided to cover CODA ahead of Presence is because this begins the discussion that I want to continue, because we're going to be covering Led Zeppelin as a band, their touring years, them personally, each individual member, what they were interested, the pitfalls of those interests, and everything else in the future. But you know, here with CODA, and we'll get to this on side 2, we see directions that Led Zeppelin could have taken, and yet we also see the past is very well represented on this album. A true wonderful album. Okay, so now that brings up a point, and this is the reason why I wanted to do this. We're going to do CODA first, then Presence, and then In Through the Outdoor. And the reason for that is In Through the Outdoor will be the final piece on these last 3 albums. And that brings up a whole point here, guys. Think about this album. Where have we seen this album approached before with Led Zeppelin? Physical Graffiti, right? Brand new tunes, or at least in this case, the newest tunes they had available. and older tunes mixed together to create an entire album, this time a single album. So what I'd like to do tonight, if you guys are willing, is to give you the CODA challenge. I want you to imagine for just a moment, where is the album Physical Graffiti on your list of the 9 albums? Is it number 1? Is it your least favorite? Is it somewhere in the middle, closer to 4 or 5 or 6? And then I want you to imagine, and I know some of these songs are in the wrong timeline, so ignore that. Some of the tracks on side 2 would have been too late in the recording process for them to have used on Physical Graffiti. But let's just use our imaginations here for a moment. Let's say Led Zeppelin had used all of this material, a very similar approach to what they achieved on Physical Graffiti, and they released Physical Graffiti as a triple album. Now, with these additional tracks, would that have made that a better or worse album, in your opinion? And with that in mind, think about now Physical Graffiti as a triple album. Where would it land on your list of favorite albums? Would it go up in your estimation if they had included these tracks, or would it go down? It's just a thought experiment. But, you know, I thought it'd be interesting to maybe start a little bit of dialogue around this video. Okay, so this album was released in November of 1982, and like I said, the album was released less than 2 years after Bonzo's death. Can you imagine? There are still Led Zeppelin fans galore, and they were chomping at the bit for this album to be released. And they were in mourning, in a sense. And this album coming out, I think the fact that Bonzo was dead almost cast a shadow over this album. Some people even say the cover looks a bit like a tombstone. And you know, I could see that, right? But you know, there was some politics behind the making of this album. You see, after Bonzo died, Led Zeppelin still had contracts to fill, right? And one of those contracts was that they owed Atlantic Records in America one more studio album. And as I've said before, Jimmy Page felt that there were so many bootleg albums available that it would be nice if they presented one final bootleg-like album. In fact, all 3 of the surviving Led Zeppelin members all have fond memories regarding these tracks. So let's get on to track 1, shall we? Okay, so first track, We're Gonna Groove. Now, I've said before how I just absolutely love the grunge. And I've even said that on Physical Graffiti that I thought the Wonton song, in many respects, was part 2 of the grunge. Well, if that was true, this track is part 3. What a groove. You know, Bonzo's drumming technique here almost sounds like he's armed with a Tommy gun and he's mowing down the target, right? And with Jimmy Page lobbing chords like he would a grenade, well placed on the field, together they destroy everything in their path. What a powerful groove this song has. And Robert Plant's vocals here are as good as anything he's ever delivered. He's got those marvelous highs, those shrieks that somehow he squeezes like he's running lemons through a blender to get those high squeals. Oh my God, what a wonderful vocal performance. And you know, talking about those grenades that Jimmy lays down, at 1 minute and 12 seconds into this recording, give that a listen to. He goes into sonic territories he's never achieved on any other Led Zeppelin track. What a wonderful showcase for all members of this band. First track right out of the gate. All right, track 2, Poor Tom. Now this is a track that was considered for Houses of the Holy. There'll be another track on this album that was also nearly on Houses of the Holy. And I just want to say this first of all. If these 2 tracks had been placed on Houses of the Holy and then everything else on Houses of the Holy, that album, in that incarnation, I'll tell you, that album would have ranked number 1 on my rankings list as Led Zeppelin's very best album. As I've said, Houses of the Holy is one of those albums that's very difficult to place, and you have to be in the mood for it. But you know, I just had a discussion with one of our commenters who said that they can't help but listen to Houses of the Holy from beginning to end. Hey, that's the way it was meant to be listened to. In fact, that's the way all of Led Zeppelin's albums were meant to be listened to. They weren't a singles band. Despite singles being issued from the band, that wasn't their fault, and that was never their intention. All right, so back to Poor Tom. What a wonderful folk song this song is. And you know what? The first 30 times I heard it, I never paid too much attention other than it's like Hang Down Your Head Tom Dooley type of song. Or a song like, you know, the man's waiting to be hanged for whatever sin he committed. But you know, it was in the mid-90s when I started re-listening to all of the Led Zeppelin albums seriously that I understood this song. You know, it's in the last verses and the last bit of the lyrics that you realize the song's narrator is Poor Tom's grandson. And at the end, he's chiding Poor Tom, who's waiting to hang. But within that same verse, he salutes him and then gives him basically a thumbs up. And by the way, since we're talking about a thumbs up, if you're enjoying this video, please consider giving us a thumbs up. It helps the YouTube algorithm better recognize us, and of course that's great for channel growth, and we want to grow as a channel. But you know what, with this song, it's not just the fact that this is a wonderful folk tale, but on top of that, Bonzo's drumming. I mean, he's all over the place on this song. I mean, you know, I was talking about how great of a feel Ringo Starr had for the drums, and that's why I place him so high. Bonzo has that exact same feel all throughout his drumming, throughout Led Zeppelin. For a powerful man like him, many drummers with his build, they just attacked it insanely, you know, but he had a feel, and swing is all over this song, folks. And even though that's so, you gotta understand, comparing Bonzo to Ringo, Ringo had swing, expert swing, but Bonzo had expert swing on steroids. And with Jimmy and John Paul supplying all the orchestration, all the symphonic sounds. You know how George Martin used to tell the Beatles, think symphonically. That's what Led Zeppelin's doing here. And John Paul Jones and Jimmy Page in the background supply a sound that's so wonderful. You know, this is one of my very favorite Led Zeppelin tracks of all time. And as far as I'm concerned, it was a mistake not to include it on Houses of the Holy. Can you imagine this song placed right after Over the Hills and Far Away, and what the lyrics of this song in combination with the lyrics of all the other songs on Houses of the Holy, what would that have created for us? All right, I Can't Quit You, Babe. This is like the first track, actually a live track from Led Zeppelin performances in January of 1970 at the Royal Albert Hall. Now, both of these tracks, track one and this one, were edited heavily. They got rid of all the atmospheric echoes that you would get from a live performance, and they did their very best to eliminate anything coming from the audience. Now, the reason they did this was to give it a more studio feel. Remember that contract with Atlantic Records? That's exactly why they mixed these songs the way they did. But you know, Jimmy Page's overdubbed solo is so fantastic. One of his very best on record, and perhaps one of my top 10 favorite Jimmy Page solos of all time. Next up, Walter's Walk, a very good track, but you know, I hear an almost gated reverb on Bonzo's drums, and I know this was recorded right at the time that Led Zeppelin was receiving a lot of criticism from new rock critics who thought that, you know, Sid Vicious and Johnny Rotten had everything to say, and old farts like Led Zeppelin should shut up, retire, and go home. And we're gonna talk about that with the last cut on this album. Don't forget I warned you on that, because I've got a lot to say about the punk scene and Led Zeppelin. But that's my only criticism, and there's even that 80s sound on a generalized delay for the whole band. I wouldn't have minded that, but that gated drum sound, you know, it makes me almost feel like I'm, for the first time in my life, listening to a Led Zeppelin song that almost sounds dated. But the total sound of the song is wonderful. This is almost pre-Tall Cool One. You know, from Now and Then, one of Robert Plant's post-Led Zeppelin albums. And it would have been interesting to see Led Zeppelin go in the direction that Robert went later, only armed with the magnificent, undefeatable team of the other three members of Led Zeppelin. All right, so that leads us to side two and the opening track, Ozone Baby. Now this is one of the tracks they actually recorded for In Through the Outdoor, and I'm wondering why this song wasn't included on that album. I think if this song and one other had been included on that album's rankings in my head would have gone up at least 2 full notches. As you know, I rank that as number 8 on my list of my favorite Led Zeppelin albums. But please remember, there's very little difference between these albums. Shades of difference as far as quality and strength of song material and Led Zeppelin's actual performance. All right, so the next track, Darlene, I think is quite an interesting track if you come to think about it. It's actually very indicative of Dancing Days. It almost has that sound, right? And you know, Robert Plant's vocals are dead on in this. But you know, it's Jimmy Page every once in a while almost throwing in slingshot guitar riffs from far to left field. Isn't that wonderful? But you know, it's later in the recording when John Paul Jones truly gets into this track with what I can only describe as an almost heavy metal smokehouse blues piano. It's very traditional, and yet it is totally new as far as the beats and where it's placed and the strength of the chords, and it adds power to this song, and yet a certain traditional sound that Led Zeppelin always revered and would always have at least a hint of on all of their songs. Wonderful track. All right, so the next track up is Bonzo's Montreal. What a wonderful track. Talk about tribal. You know, I've talked about joining the tribe on this channel. This whole track is tribal to me. And you know, at this point, I want to give you a kind of a comparative track, if you're willing to do so and listen to it. How about McCartney's, on the McCartney album, side 2, his magnificent Cree na Cour? You might say, what? Are you kidding me? This is not Cree na Cour. But they both are very tribal sounding, and they're both heavily influenced by percussion, right? Only if McCartney's Cree na Cour is tribal in the jungle, right? Bonzo's Montreal is tribal on freaking steroids. I could listen to this track all day. In fact, many times I just put it on a repeat when I'm doing housework or I'm doing yard work. I love his whole percussive approach on this song. What a genius. What a magnificent drummer. And truly, the heartbeat of Led Zeppelin. Okay, so that brings us to the final cut of the album, Wearing and Tearing. You know, members of Led Zeppelin have all said they wrote this in reaction to new punk music coming along on the scene. But you know, I thoroughly disagree with him. I don't think this is a recording that was recorded in reaction to the punk scene. I think this is a recording that was recorded as a lesson to the punk scene. Now, I got to admit, I'm not a big punk fan. Don't get me wrong, punk was necessary. And there are a few tracks that I find okay. And some of the bands that came from the edges of that punk sound, bands like The Police or The Clash, I love. And so I see them as a necessary step into the 80s. But you know, I was more than happy to see them fade into rock history. I was sick of the type of musicians they were. I've been practicing guitar for 6 weeks. I got something to say. Not to me, you don't. All right? But there was some genius moves in there, so don't crucify me for my statements. I'm just not a punk fan. I never was. But you know, this song more than anything else shows that Led Zeppelin has achieved a professorship in rock. There's only one other band that received their professorship in rock, and that was the Beatles. The Beatles and Led Zeppelin taught the rest of the world how to write songs, how to record music, how to present it, and how to make it evolve within a band. And if there's a sad part to all of this tale, it's the fact that so many younger bands never got the lesson. They got a D+, C-, maybe a C, an occasional B album out of it, right? I mean, really, if you think about it, most fans would consider this Led Zeppelin's weakest album. And you know, if I'm pushed to the wall, I have to agree with them. But that's only because this album is contending against 8 masterpieces in their own right. And with cuts on side 2 of this album being recorded at the same time of In Through the Outdoor, this gives us an almost extra appreciation for that album. Now, my next video on Led Zeppelin, I'll be covering the album Presence, who ranks quite high in my ranking, unlike most people. But then after that, I'm going to be covering the last album Led Zeppelin ever produced, with all 4 members being living entities, and that is In Through the Outdoor, and we'll tie all these points together. Now, there's a method to my madness, and I do want to hear from you folks on what you think about this album, all right? It's my humble opinion, Led Zeppelin never made a bad album. They only made great albums. And this is a great album. Most bands would have been proud of this album. If this is Led Zeppelin's weakest album and the rest are true masterpieces, at least on one level or another, what does that say about this magnificent band? Think of all that the Beatles accomplished in 7 years. Now, Led Zeppelin had more time, but they were in a faster lane. By the time the Beatles had quit, the whole approach to what a band was modified quite heavily, and in my opinion, Led Zeppelin was at the forefront of changing exactly what the top band in rock could do and achieve.